is The Nine Lives of Pakistan, where we are going to be in conversation with the writer, Declan Walsh, who, a quick intro about the writer. Declan covered Pakistan for over a decade for The Guardian and The New York Times. The Pakistani authorities expelled him in 2013, citing unspecified undesirable activities. Walsh has reported from the sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, the United States, and across the Middle East. He lives in Nairobi. Thank you for joining us, Declan.
Great to be here. Thank you.
He will be in conversation with Neena Gopal, who is a journalist who has been a journalist for 37 years. She began her career in Bangalore, that was a hotbed for post-emergency politics. Moving to the UAE in the 1980s, she worked for the Dubai-based daily Gulf News, where as foreign editor, she traveled the Middle East during and after Operation Desert Storm, the first Gulf War in 1990, covering war-torn Iraq and its neighbors through the Second Gulf War in 2003. She currently edits the Bangalore edition of Deccan Chronicle. Thank you for joining us, Neena. And with that, over to you.
Actually, I must correct you, Mohan. I have stepped away as editor of Deccan Chronicle.
Okay.
I'm now enjoying my rare burst of freedom.
That's
that I don't have to bring out a newspaper every day.
Okay, thank you for that edit.
But I mean, I think it's a, I wanted to start by congratulating Declan on this wonderful book, The Nine Lines of Pakistan. I think it's one of the most riveting books I've read, basically because, you've used your interviews with, these very interesting people to set the narrative on, so many aspects of Pakistan, which, you come across and you see, we never link them all together. You've dotted the I's, you've told us you crossed the T's, and you've actually told a story 9 times. When I originally saw the title, I said, does he mean Pakistan has survived 9 lives, or has he picked on 9 people to write about, which is what you've done. But I also want to congratulate you on the fact that you've picked up so many different aspects of Pakistan, like on like Nawab Akbar Bukti and Azma Jahangir, who's the human rights activist who you call, the fabulous senorita. You must tell us why. And, your friend Anwar Kamal Khan. And of course, the shock that you must have felt when you were suddenly banned from the country. So it would be great if you could actually tell us what it was like, what that day was like when you were summoned on the phone and handed your expulsion orders. And did you see it coming? Were there any red flags? You knew your phone was tapped. You knew you were followed. Which I think all of us journalists have faced whenever we land in that country. But you also say that the most interesting chapter of all is this complete stranger who reaches out to you and tells you what those red lines were that you crossed. So if you could take us through that, that would be very interesting. Unknowingly crossed, of course.
Sure. Thanks so much, Neena. It's fantastic to be with you this morning. Look, the story for me started, I guess, the story of the book started for me as well, personally, I think, in terms of the writing of it, with that incident with my expulsion just before the election in 2013. I had been at a friend's place quite late at night in Islamabad. There was a lot of gupshup, a lot of chat about the politics, obviously. We were just a couple of days out from the vote. There was a lot of excitement because in Pakistan, that election was seen as very significant at the time. We had just gone through one election cycle after Pervez Musharraf had been forced from office effectively. And Pakistanis and a lot of other people were very excited that here was the first time that in this country, which had had so many military takeovers and so much heavy military influence on politics for decades, really, that here is, one civilian government finishing its term and about to hand over peacefully to another. So there was a historic element about this moment. And then, very briefly, as I recount in the book, I was summoned home by a phone call from an anonymous number. And when I got home at about midnight, I found this truckload or a couple of pickups with police officers. And then this one plainclothes man stepped out from the crowd. He handed me a letter And it was a very short letter which just said your visa is cancelled with immediate effect on account of your undesirable activities, and you've got 72 hours to leave. And then there followed, a very hectic period where I at first believed I was going to be able to get this order overthrown, then became resigned to the fact that I wasn't. I learned that it was the intelligence, the ISI, that was behind the move. And eventually I went to Lahore to report on the elections. On my last day, ran into the authorities again, the military. I was held for a period in a hotel and then driven to the airport. So when I got to London, that was really where I started to think about, at first I tried to get back into Pakistan very hard, and the editors at the New York Times met with Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, who was then in charge, and I met with senior military figures, including from the ISI in London, where I was kind of living in sort of unofficial exile, if you like. And then after a while, it became clear that was not going to happen, and so that was really the starting point for the book. Then it was like, well, what was it that led me to get kicked out? And at once it was a sort of a personal story about this issue, but it was also a broader thing for me about stepping back from this country that I had been, so involved with for a decade at that point, and trying to figure out how do I tell a story about, what I'd seen that was relevant, both in terms of the people I'd met, the events that had happened, but also the bigger enduring themes about Pakistan that have dominated the country really since its foundation in 1947.
Did you feel that that at any point in time that you had crossed that red line? I mean, did someone tell you that you shouldn't interview Bukti, or you shouldn't have gone into Waziristan, or uh, in Karachi when you were with that, I've forgotten that man's name. When you were with that gentleman who, the writer.
Khan, yeah.
Yes.
So when I arrived in Pakistan in 2004, and at that point, even then there were places where it was not possible to go as a foreign journalist, or at least not possible to go unaccompanied. For instance, the tribal belt. Similarly with Azad Kashmir, Pakistani Kashmir, was also not possible to go there without permission, and permission was very hard to get. But as things went on, and as Pakistan became a much more tumultuous place, certainly there were greater restrictions on going to certain hotspots, like, for instance, Balochistan. But I still managed to get there. There were ways at that time to get around some of those restrictions. So it was always clear that there were places that the government or parts of the security services didn't want you to go. There were certain stories that were sensitive, but there was also a very strong sense that as a foreign journalist or as an outsider, you had a certain privilege. You were able to get away with things that in the local press were much harder, writing about certain topics. And in fact, often I would find that, if I did a story on a particularly sensitive topic, for instance, some form of human rights abuses involving the military, this might be a story that the local press might have been a little shy of until then for good reasons. But once we'd written about it, say in The Guardian or later in the New York Times, the local press would feel a sense of permission, that they could say, well, The Guardian has written about this. So, honestly, there were certainly restrictions, there were certainly difficulties in reporting in a country like Pakistan, but, I honestly, I did not see the expulsion coming. And I think in retrospect, it's clear to me, and it's clear to, I think, a lot of my Pakistani colleagues, that what happened to me, pales in comparison to what's happened to many Pakistani journalists, many of whom frankly have died. But it was a sign of a shift, that was a broader shift that was taking place at that time, where the authorities, they had gone through a series of traumas, embarrassments, humiliations. There had been, the Taliban uprising. There was the American raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Had been a lot of political tumult, and I think now looking back, it's clear that this was a period where the military, the intelligence services, were trying to reassert themselves. and to some degree to control the story that was being told about Pakistan. And I think their main focus then and now is the Pakistani press. But what happened to me was maybe a sign that also they felt someone like me had overstayed my welcome or had gotten to places or to stories that they did not appreciate.
It's interesting that the access that you were also able to, have to all of these characters. I mean, nobody blocked you from meeting people. But I was fascinated by the chapter on Azma Jahangir because of the manner in which you sort of hid and sort of, were smuggled in by Munize, her daughter. So could you tell us something about that? Why was she? I mean, what struck me the most about that chapter also was the fact that she was a rich, entitled woman. I mean, she was not from a poor background. And yet she stood up against the very class that she represented. The elite who sort of, took over, who basically ran Pakistan, the few families. She was ranting and raving against them. She also had a very tough stance against the military. And yet, it was the ISI chief, the Inter-Service Intelligence chief, who came and warned her that there would be a move to bump her off. So all of those things. Could you explain this woman that you call, the senorita, and what was she like? And the second part of my question was about her and Benazir. I mean, they were women from similar backgrounds, and their fathers were friends, and yes, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, you say, jailed her father. And yet, the father was the one who was broken up totally when Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was hanged. And Azma Jahangir ranted and raved against Benazir as well. But in the end, it was Azma who actually rang Benazir and warned her that there was a plot to kill her. So could you is she part of this? Is there that kind of a feeling within the elite that they are angry against the establishment and yet part of the establishment?
Thank you. I guess, I mean, for a start, Asma Jahangir was undoubtedly, I think, one of the most impressive people that I've met. I'm not sure, she certainly came from the elite, as you say, and she used her privilege, she used her background to fight against injustice, to fight against discrimination. She trained as a lawyer relatively late in life after she got married. And once she became a lawyer, she became a lawyer at this crucial time, really, during the General Zia years, when the Hudud ordinances had been introduced in Pakistan. The testimony of a woman in a rape case was much less than that of a man. There was a whole raft of discriminatory measures that were being brought in by the state under the laws of Pakistan, and she led the resistance against that, along, it has to be said, with other women from her social class who were not very numerous, but they were loud and vocal, and they took to the streets of Lahore and they clashed with the police. And so, her story is the story of a woman from this position of privilege, but unlike many people in a similar position, uses that privilege as a weapon, in a way, to fight these battles against repression, against the dominance of the military, against some of the really ugly currents that run through Pakistani society, in which extremist views sometimes come to dominate. But I think it's important to recognize that while she, some in her social class, if you like, in Lahore, did view her as a kind of class traitor. They thought that it was not the place of a woman to start these fights, and it was not the place of someone from that particular background, where others might be more concerned with, I don't know, you see people in other public figures would be in the fashion business or in industry or maybe in the socialites and things like that. But it is one of the really interesting things about Pakistan that you do see some of the brave people who've taken on these issues actually do come from the upper crust of society, and that's one of the complexities of the country that really I found fascinating when I lived there. It's not to say, of course, that they're the only people, but that there is a group of people in society who are willing to leverage what they have. And Asma really is. One of the reasons I chose to focus on her is that really I think she's the best example of that. But she was more than that too. She was a woman who used her law practice to stand up for some of the most discriminated against people in society. And I think, Neena, more than anything else, rather than necessarily fight against her class, I think that, she fought against the notion that the state did not treat all citizens equally. And I think, you look at many countries across South Asia, as well as Pakistan, India, and others, you see that, there are extremists everywhere, there are prejudices and discrimination everywhere. The key factor, in my view, and I think perhaps if I can speak for someone like Asma Jahangir as well, she's no longer with us, but I think for people like her and the conversations that we had, it was clear that they diagnosed the problem as being principally when the state does not act as a neutral arbiter between people, when the state itself, through the laws or through the security services or the government or the local authorities, when they don't act as a neutral arbiter in these problems, that's when you have a real fight on your hands. And I think actually at its core, a lot of what she stood for, what Asma Jahangir stood for, was that.
And her relationship with Benazir Bhutto?
Yeah, I mean, Benazir was, in a way came from a similar from a similar sort of set of circumstances. In fact, as I recount in the book, Benazir's father and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto were political comrades in the 1960s when the demonstrations and the movement against military rule was taking place, the first big anti-military demonstrations. So they had so much in common. And yet, as women who were, prominent in public life, they went down very different routes. Benazir obviously went down the politics route and sought to affect change through that way. And in some ways, Benazir Bhutto was the kind of person who Asma Jahangir would criticize vividly because she had been a leader of the country, and especially during her 2 terms of office, Benazir disappointed a lot of her own supporters because she failed to introduce the kind of reforms, for instance, overturning the Hudud ordinances that, that those people sought and that they thought that she would do. But what I found fascinating is, just before Asma Jahangir died, which is a couple of years ago, she gave a talk at Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford. And she spoke about her the whole talk was about her relationship with Benazir Bhutto. And even though they had been quite critical of each other in different ways while alive, they had been allies at times, but they had certainly also criticized each other at times, privately and publicly. It was a very affectionate speech that she gave. And she outlined their complex past. She outlined how they had a sort of sometimes strained, sometimes odd relationship, but ultimately they had a common vision for change, I think. Now, Benazir, clearly a more contentious figure in Pakistan and beyond. There's, it's a whole separate discussion there, but I don't doubt that, in her politics, Benazir Bhutto sought a similar kind of, she had a similar vision to Asma Jahangir for what Pakistan would become. And of course, they also had a shared adversary in the military. Benazir Bhutto for all the obvious reasons, Asma Jahangir because really, when she wasn't fighting for dispossessed people or people who've been discriminated against, Christians, victims of the blasphemy laws, people who've been disappeared into military detention and so on. Her broader fight was against the dominance of the military in power. and the dominance of the military over civilian governments. And so, at the time when Benazir Bhutto returned to Pakistan, both of these women were very much on the same page in 2007. Benazir Bhutto was returning, as you recall, to prepare to contest a general election against Pervez Musharraf. Asma Jahangir herself had just been locked up by Musharraf, or put under house arrest by Musharraf, when he was, desperately trying to hold on to his crumbling power, and he imposed emergency rule. So both of these women at that important juncture in Pakistan's recent history, found themselves firmly on the same page, and in a way, that circle of that mutual relationship that they had that went back decades had kind of come full circle. And of course, tragically, it was a very brief-lived moment. Benazir returned in October of 2007, and she was dead by the end of December. But I know that, her death was something that marked Asma Jahangir very deeply. And in fact, while other people might have been, put off or frightened after the death of Benazir, because of course, even though the Taliban killed her, or carried out the suicide bombing that killed her, there was and is in Pakistan a very a lingering suspicion that the military also played a role in it. So where for some that death would have been a chastening event that might have silenced them or encouraged them to quiet their tongue, Asma Jahangir went in the other direction, and she only stepped up her criticism. And in fact, when after Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011, she used that moment effectively, to go on Pakistani television and say some very sharp and disparaging things about the strength of the military, about its failures, and really, called very memorably. She went on television and she said, "Oh, these people are useless duffers," which became a phrase that was sort of associated with her. She said they're only interested in running wedding halls and making money, and they can't, they couldn't even either detect the Americans coming, or they were unable to detect Osama bin Laden living there, or whatever the truth was. So, you saw this woman whose courage, even after the death of Benazir, traumatic event for the entire country, she only went from one strength to another.
The other very interesting chapter, Declan, was on Salman Taseer. He was assassinated by his bodyguard, most famously because he stood up for Asia Bibi, the first woman to be accused of blasphemy, you say. And, you describe him as a very smart, savvy politician who picked the wrong battle. You quote his half-Indian son, Atish Taseer, calling him a hypocrite. Cultural Muslim who use religion as a cloak. I mean, I found all these phrases very interesting, particularly because Atish Taseer was a very successful, very well-known author today. But apparently, what he wrote about his father is what sort of was used by the mullahs to paint Salman Taseer as as a person who should be killed. But the other interesting aspect of that chapter is the fact that the foreign educated upper class that Salman Taseer came from. You say it's this eternal fight between the good Muslim and the apostate. Which I thought was also very interesting, because I mean it's an eternal argument. It's happening now in France. It's happening across Europe. With that man, with that teacher Samuel Paty being decapitated by by a person. But is that, you think, is this whiskey swilling kind of elite in Pakistan? Will they ever have a say, or will they ever have any kind of impact on Pakistan? Because more and more it looks as if it's it's the extreme fundamentalist. At least when you were there, more so when you were there. Is the one that calls the shots in many ways. It's not the city. It's in the out there in the remote regions where where these decisions are taken, and it impacts people like Benazir and and Salman Taseer.
Well, I think that when I wrote the chapter about Salman Taseer, when I wanted to introduce it, you know, that was it. I think that you know I think that the debate between the tension, if you like, between people in the elite or progressive Pakistanis more general, whether it's from the elite or not, and between progressives and those who have a different vision, a more extremist vision for the future of the country. You know, the period when I was there, I feel that that battle was very much hung in the balance. You know, and people like Asma Jahangir, Salman Taseer, and others, you know, were fighting that battle. That's why I focused on them, and that's why I thought that they were so fantastically interesting as people, you know, to meet and to witness close up. And on the blasphemy front, you know, one of the things I tried to achieve in the book really was to, you know, focus on these 9 characters, to tell the stories of these, you know, incredibly fascinating people, and but also to like draw and to recount what the dramatic events of that time that many of them lived very close to, and risked their lives on, but also to draw from those experiences the sort of to draw out the enduring problems and the enduring issues that Pakistan's had down the decades. And blasphemy is one of those. But it's also, I've come to think about it recently, it's one of these issues that, you know, has in some ways gotten worse since that time. You know, the death of Salman Taseer, he was assassinated by his own bodyguard outside a restaurant in Islamabad. That, you know, that was such a traumatic event at the time, and it was kind of the culmination of a change in the blasphemy laws that had been instigated in the 1980s under General Zia. But you know, it showed just how this this issue had been instrumentalized, particularly by the religious right. And since then, unfortunately, we see that it's gotten worse. I mean, the blasphemy has now become a kind of political platform in Pakistan. There are, you know, massive street demonstrations against sitting government ministers. In one instance, got a cabinet member fired, and these demonstrations are led by by extremist clerics, and they often draw tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people across the country. So, you know, for me, that is a somewhat dispiriting phenomenon in that fight, if you like, between, you know, the progressives who have who have their own vision for what the relationship between religion and the state should be, and these other forces. But by the same token, I don't think it's the only battle. And you know, there are other places in which ground has been clawed back or ground has been won. And I see, when I look to Pakistan, I see a place where so much is still to play for. You know, there are still, you know, many signs of, you know, young people in particular who are, you know, I mean, all the obvious things, incredibly well educated and articulate and so on, but also who have a very firm vision for what they want the country to be. And it's very different to that of the extremists. And you do see the pushback. I mean, you know, Imran Khan's government, when Imran Khan was elected, he was elected on a wave of support from young people who wanted something different and who were drawn by his ideas. Now, of course, there's much criticism of Imran Khan's of his ideas. There certainly was, even when I was there, and there has been plenty of criticism of the way he has governed since then. And I think that even his strongest supporters would probably admit, at least privately, that he has not delivered, you know, as they had hoped, certainly in the time he's been in power. But you know, what he did tap into successfully to get elected, I think, in large measure, is, you know, the desire of young Pakistanis for you know, a more modern identity, for a different kind of country. You know, not all, but these things are complicated. You know, not all entirely progressive ideas, perhaps, or you know, it can sometimes the lines are quite jagged, but on the whole, I think it's a sign that, you know, here's this country with a huge youthful population that is very aspirational. And so I don't think its destiny is written in stone necessarily, but you do see some very disturbing trend lines. And I see the furor over blasphemy, the instrumentalization of religion by extremist forces as being one that, you know, if there's not a course correction, could lead to some very negative consequences.
this is the two sides of Pakistan. Like there are the two sides of India. We have an aspirational middle class. We have young people who want a better life and all of that. But they're also tied down by old conservative mores and very old beliefs. So I mean, to break with that and actually step into the this IT world and all of these things. It's a different. It's a big thing. I mean, India is doing it, but like in Pakistan, it must be tough. The which brings us to this whole, which ties in with this next question, which I have on, I love the chapter, the War of the Flea. I love that phrase because I really honestly think that I don't think anyone saw, the Nawab Akbar Bukti, having this fight with Musharraf, and for Musharraf to actually deploy all those, the army and track him down and corner him in his, fort. And I mean, it's such a dramatic end to a very colorful character. And your interview with him was brilliant because he really is entertaining and nasty and nice, and he's a real combination of all kinds of attributes. If you could just tell us a little bit about him, which would be great. And I was also fascinated by your interview with Brahmadak Bukti, meeting him, in Geneva. And what came through is, despite everyone saying that India meddles or the whoever meddles, I think Balochistan is a really native rebellion. I think it comes from the fact that the Murrays and the Mengals and the Buktis do not like being told, or being manipulated by the Punjabi, the army or whatever it is. And the fight that you say that Bukti had with Musharraf over the Sui gas pipeline, is what was a trigger for all of this. If you could just take us through that, that would be very interesting. And my question at the end of that chapter was, is it going to go anywhere, or is it just going to be another, like you say, the War of the Fleet?
Yeah, Nawab Bukti, I met him fairly early on in my time in Pakistan. At the time, he was not a major news figure, I guess, but he was just becoming one. This dispute had started with the military over the expansion of drilling at the Sui gas plant, which was on his tribal lands, if you like. And I drove out to see him. We kind of slipped out of Quetta one morning with a guy who was helping me, and we drove for hours and hours across this absolutely sort of alien landscape with these giant rocks like houses and very stark landscape. And eventually we sort of reached this fort in the desert, and the door opened in sort of dramatic fashion, and Nawab Bukti presented himself, and and then he came out and he said to me, "Oh, who do you work for?" And I said, "Oh, I work for the Guardian." I was working for the Guardian at the time. And he said, "Oh, I prefer the Times." And then proceeded to go inside and left me waiting for a few more hours. So he was one of these great characters who, as you said, by no means black and white. When I was there, he could be very cruel with people. He would sort of taunt them at the same, and he was quite vain and boastful. He liked to show off the fact that he was very well read, and while we were sitting there, he pulls out this piece of poetry by Rabindranath Tagore and so on. So but he had this just incredible life for decades and decades, running this tribe in government, out of government. He'd been there right from the beginning of Pakistan, and he also, the interesting thing about him was that at that time, even among the Baloch, he was a very contentious figure. He was seen as someone who had collaborated with the military and with the governments in the past. I think he had been if I recall, he'd been a governor or a minister under General Zia in the local government. And so, he was by no means seen as a Baloch nationalist. But again, this, a sort of a dynamic or a problem that had been festering for decades was sort of coming to a boil at the time when I got there, which is this broader relationship between the Baloch and the central government, and the military in particular. And, this is a tension that you find in several parts of Pakistan. Just like in India, you have regional tensions as well, or areas where there are localized insurgencies. And so, in Pakistan, you have several areas where, between parts of the Pashtun, parts of the Baloch, even parts of Sindhis, you've seen these, if either uprisings or political movements, where people feel that they are not seen by the central government, or they feel that their interests are not represented, and they take to some form of action. And so, he came, despite himself, over this dispute over the gas. It sort of catalyzed into this, it became part of this wider conflict between people in Balochistan and the military. There was a sense that the government at that time, the Musharraf government, was trying to exploit their resources, was looking to mine their, they have a lot of mineral wealth under the soil. They have gas. They have a huge shore on the Arabian Sea that China was starting to exploit. And so, Nawab Bukti found himself, a very local fight suddenly became part of a bigger fight, and ultimately, as you said, led to his demise. And in that meeting, I met his grandson, Bramda, who was sort of sitting beside me at dinner. It turned out that he was wanted by the government at the time because he had been accused of leading a rocket attack against the gas plant at Sui as part of that original dispute. And then later he went off, after his grandfather was killed, he disappeared from view for many, many years. And eventually I found him in Geneva, where he was living in exile with his family, and still to some degree managing the affairs of his tribe by remote control, almost over the phone, and most likely leading one of the armed groups, or said at least to be leading one of the armed groups that were rising that have been fighting against Pakistani state. To your point about Indian support, I mean, I don't think there's much doubt, certainly people I've spoken to, that the Indian state probably has given support to some of these Baloch groups, maybe through Dubai. There have been well-publicized cases of Indian intelligence people coming from Iran who've been arrested and so on. But by the same token, I think it is true that, perhaps for people in the Indian establishment, this is payback for Kashmir to some degree, and it's a way of niggling the Pakistani security establishment as part of this, grudge match that goes on, behind the scenes between the two countries. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the grievances of the Baloch are, genuine and rooted in a history of marginalization and a failure of politics, really, in the province. And for me, that one of the most interesting things about the Baloch conflict is that on a military level, it is not a significant threat really to the Pakistani army. The Baloch groups are relatively small in number. They've had relatively few successes on a military level against the army. They've carried out ambushes. There certainly have been some bombings, but nothing on a scale that would really seriously worry the Pakistani military. And yet the military has prosecuted its campaign against the insurgents with great alacrity, rounding up people, holding them for months or even years on end. Many people have been tortured, of these disappeared, have been found dead with marks of torture. And so, once I stepped out of Pakistan and sort of thought about, like, why is it that this conflict seems to occupy such a large part in their psyche, and I think the answer, there are many answers to that, but I think that one of the answers, at least a significant answer, is that here's this part of Pakistan that 70 years on is still not under full state control effectively, or where there's a significant portion of the population that is rebelling against the state. And I guess for the Pakistani military, there are psychological scars that go back to the war in East Pakistan in 1971. And that, of course, is part of a bigger issue in Pakistan, where the country's identity problems are not just about the role of religion; they're also about folding this very diverse array of regional and ethnic groups, into one country, and for everyone to have one shared idea of what it means to be a Pakistani. And so, when you see the Baloch, you see Pashtuns rising, in civil rights movements, you see Sindhi, to a smaller degree, Sindhi groups rising, and others. And you see that, this is, apart from the problems about religion, there's also a challenge for the Pakistani state to have a sense of inclusivity, that all of these groups, ethnic groups, tribal groups, regional groups, will feel a sense of common purpose and identity. And that, to me, seems to also be, like a serious challenge to the country as much as the militancy stuff.
Yeah, that is true. In fact, the fact that you talk about these ethnic issues is quite interesting, because that is one of the reasons that in Waziristan and in the Northwest Frontier, sorry, now it's called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, there's a rise of this new movement, which is the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which is also getting to be a challenge for the central government in Pakistan. But could you tell us about the, you've also made a very interesting comment about the ISI, the Pakistan Spy Agency, in your chapter on your friend Colonel Imam, where you say that that they didn't get it right, that they got it wrong in so many ways. I always thought the ISI was supreme, but you've got a comment from one of your British, spies, who says they're a bumbling, they're not that smart. But could you tell us a little bit about the fact why they did this? Why did they pit the good Taliban versus the bad Taliban? And why they used Colonel Imam, and how they brought in the Taliban as a proxy, as a proxy for its fight its wars in Afghanistan. That it's very interesting that the ISI today, I feel, is far more powerful than it was when Nawaz was there, or when Benazir was there, or even until recently. Now they seem to be all powerful, and especially when they went after you. Do you feel that they're growing in power, or diminished, or?
Well, the ISI really has been growing in power since the 1980s. Obviously, it started during the General Zia era. In essence, it started in the 80s during the Jihad, when the ISI had allied with the Americans and with Saudi money to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. And since then, there has been this steady accumulation, I think, of influence and power as a tool of military influence. Of course, it's not an agency that operates on its own. It operates firmly, I believe, under the command of under the military high command, or under senior generals, its role changes depending on the era or depending on the time. So obviously, during Musharraf, it had a different role than it might have during a civilian government. But when it comes on the point of its competencies, I think it's a complicated question. There are certain things the ISI is actually very good at. It's very good at following people. It's very good at manipulating politics in Pakistan. It's very good at picking up perceived opponents of the government or of the security forces. It's had some victories in counterterrorism and so on. But I guess my point was more that the weaknesses of the ISI have largely been strategic. They have been, getting to your question about good and bad Taliban, they get to this idea that again stemmed really from the 70s and from the 1980s, that Pakistan would be able to achieve its security objectives by supporting Islamist guerrillas, such as those who had fought in Afghanistan, supporting them in other theaters. So, clearly in Indian-controlled Kashmir, in the Taliban in Afghanistan in the 1990s, and even in other parts of Asia, the ISI had a role in supporting those groups, in furtherance of the military's foreign policy objectives, effectively. While that policy on its own terms was actually successful to some degree. as you saw in Kashmir through the 1990s, these groups that were coming across the LOC, did really, test the Indian military that was deployed there, and forced the Indian military then moved into a much more aggressive stance and alienated some of the local population, and we see the fruits of that today. But I guess on the ISI's terms, those campaigns may have been successful. But again, during the Musharraf period, we saw those contradictions, come to the fore, and we saw, the ISI itself becoming coming under direct attack from Taliban groups who are angry at Pakistan's alliance with the United States after 2001. And so, on the one hand, you have a security establishment that has nurtured some of these groups down the years. And at the same time, you have a government or a military-led government that is allying with the United States and trying to hunt down Al-Qaeda, especially inside Pakistan. And so that tension, came to a boil really with the attacks against Musharraf, with the direct attacks against the military in Rawalpindi, the attacks on ISI buses carrying ISI employees to work, or ISI headquarters in places like Multan. So, really, when you point to the failures of this spy agency, you see that at the strategic level, the chickens were coming home to roost at that point. And I think, the country has wrestled with that ever since. But, in recent years, we see a different trend happening. We actually see that the military has imposed itself on politics very strongly, even though Imran Khan is running the country. You see that the military still has a lot of influence on the way it's on the major foreign policy issues, Afghanistan, to some degree the relationship with India and so on, and the relationship with America. So, we're now, I think, in a time where the military has a very strong hand on the levers of power in the country, and certainly the ISI is part of that. But I would say it is one tool among others in that setup.
Declan, this is a question from a very respected gentleman. He wants to, he's got three questions. I'm only going to pick one because we're running out of time. I just have one last question about how wonderful it is to read a book which doesn't have any nasty feelings about Pakistan, despite the fact they threw you out. It still comes across as a book which is very, pro-Pakistan. I really like that. The fact that you have friends there, that you've continued to maintain relationships with people there. That is lovely. That's one thing I wanted to talk about. This gentleman says, don't ordinary Pakistanis want, sir, I can't read your handwriting, cultural and trade interaction with India, right? Do they want a novel relationship with India?
Well, I'll tell you, when I lived in Pakistan, I knew many people like that. And in fact, I had friends who, visited India regularly, drove across the border. I knew people who had started to do business in India. So I don't doubt that there are many Pakistanis who have that desire. And of course, at that period, it was the moment of cricket diplomacy between Musharraf and Manmohan Singh. There were cricket matches. People would come backwards, and I remember Indians coming to Pakistan, getting a very warm welcome. But I think, as ever, those desires are in large degree hostage to the politics. And I think that when Pakistanis look across the border at the direction of India, particularly in the last number of years, they see the treatment of Muslims, the discrimination against Muslims by parts of the state, some of the things that have happened. They look at the situation in Kashmir. I think to some degree that sense of goodwill, I feel that it is starting to sour among progressive Pakistanis. I remember when I was there, there was, I remember there were a lot of people, for instance, who were doing these track 2 talks. They would go off to Bangkok and they would meet with, Indian counterparts, talking about ways to kickstart the peace process between the two countries. As I understand it, and I'm happy to be contradicted, I understand a lot of that has stopped. And I on a personal level, I just feel it's very sad that those, linkages have broken down. It's harder for Indians and Pakistanis to travel between the two countries. So, in short, I agree that there are many people, on both sides of the border who have a real yearning and a desire for those kind of cultural linkages, and I saw them happening when I lived there. But it does seem that those things are hostage to politics, and the politics at the moment are not conducive to that. On your own question about my good relations with the country, I mean, all I would say is that it's kind of a cliche of foreign correspondence that a foreigner like me will go and live in a country and say that people were welcoming and generous and warm and all of that. And all of that, of course, is true in Pakistan, as it would be in India. But I think what I found extraordinary about the country and really drew to me was I met so many people who were willing not just to, offer a meal or hospitality, but were willing to be open, very frank about their lives, about what was going on with them, kind of let me in the door in a way, but invite me to their homes or let me ride along with them and so on. And, I've worked in a good number of countries now, and I can tell you that there are countries where you get that kind of access, and there are countries where that access is quite hard. And so as a reporter, that was one of the incredibly gratifying things about the country. And of course, that we're not automatons, we're human beings, and you meet people. And even if, like many of the people in this book, they are very complex, often flawed people with, black and white and a lot of gray. You are, as a reporter, you're drawn to their stories, and as a person, you're drawn to them as people. You understand that we all have, different impulses. We have different forces acting on us. We don't always take great decisions, and that allowed me to identify with them, and that was part of really why I just loved living there.
Anyway, well done on a fabulous book. It's worth reading. I mean, I think it's one of the nicest books I've read on Pakistan in the last 6 months. And I've read many books on Pakistan. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Neena. It's been great to be with you.
Great. Thank you, Declan, and thank you, Neena, for